Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to talk about Stamford, which is a beautiful town in Lincolnshire, and it is the first conservation area in England in 1967. It has over 600 listed buildings in its town centre, which is half the total for all of Lincolnshire. It's a really, really special place. Primarily built in the 17th and 18th century with both Georgian and Jacobean architecture, and it's tied together, knitted together with beautiful Lincolnshire limestone. It's a valley bottom settlement with lots of key landmarks, punctuating landmarks throughout, with landscape and stone tying it all together. Ironmonger Street, a lovely mixed-use street in the centre that gives a sense of a great pedestrian experience. More intimate residential streets, normally with landmarks at the end of them, but a real range and variety of building types and street types. And I think the thing that we wanted to do here was not rush to design, because really a town like this, I think it's important you understand the context, the place before you do that. That any master planning emerges from context and from place. And what we try and do in towns like this, we're working in quite a few historic towns at the moment, is to do pattern books, which were a Victorian tool for understanding the DNA of a place, so that further designers could build on those and really understand how they worked. So in terms of the wider context, it's interesting because we wanted to quantify the growth. Our site is the red line boundary to the west. The red core is historic, and obviously it evolves over that 100 years. But interestingly, 60% of the growth in Stamford is from the 1950s. And this town goes way back to the before the 16th century. So a lot of the growth has happened recently, which is interesting. And much of it is not really of the same unifying qualities, I think, as the previous sort of generations, really, in terms of the typology, stone, and urban space. Now, in terms of tying things together, really the two things that we wanted to get across in a pattern book here was learning from density. How does density relate to typology? And what we often find when we're talking to people is they don't really understand PPS3 density and you know how that's calculated and how that works. And even as urban designers, we've had many long debates about what this means and what's included and what's not included and how you calculate it. So it's even more confusing, I think, for local people often and stakeholders to understand what it's like. We really wanted our pattern book to help people understand what density was, how you calculate it, using examples from their own neighborhoods. So there's the potential site, the red line, which I should say is an allocation at the moment. We're going for an allocation. So we haven't been allocated anything as of yet, but we're just going through the master planning process right now and trying to provide as much contextual information as possible to town councillors, stakeholders, local people. But we chose a number of neighbourhoods around the site, ranging from historic terraces to contemporary suburbs. And we wanted to give local people an understanding of what these typologies meant, what their houses meant, what densities were they in relation to PPS3. And in particular, how did those relate to what we were planning in a master plan, so that there's an integration, a seamless integration between contextual surrounding densities based on PPS3 and what we're proposing. So we do a density summary table which ranges from 47 to 7 dph, from lovely Georgian terraces to villas with more contemporary suburban development in between. And that's just sort of a snapshot to give people an understanding of that. But in terms of the methodology, I just want to very quickly go through one particular example. This is Rutland Terrace from 1829. I mean, it was gorgeous then, and it's gorgeous now. And I think this is very high value property in Stamford. It faces south, it's got wonderful light, and it's got open fields in front of it. And I think just in terms of calculating that, it's a very simple table really, which comes up with a dwellings per hectare ratio based on PPS3, based on that definition in the Annex B of PPS3. And it comes out at 47 dwellings per hectare. Now when we presented this to town councillors, they were surprised that it was so high, and that they liked something that was almost 50 dwellings per hectare. So I mean, this is a really loved piece of architecture in the town, and it really showed people, I think, that they don't need to be afraid of slightly higher densities in urban extensions, and that was a key point there. I think often when we do these calculations, we're also looking at ratios of private open space, the second column in from the right, you're right, and if there's not green nearby, then we add NPFA standards, National Playing Field standards to that, so 0.8 hectares per thousand population into the mix, and that will lower densities down a little bit basically. But if we just quickly run through, it's important not only to use classic historic examples. I think this is a mixed tenure development just to the north. It's 32 DPH, just above that PPS3 minimum that we were all shooting for before, which was 30. A range of different house typologies here. When we move into more classic suburbia, drops to 23 because of the private open space, larger private open space. And typologically here, we're dealing primarily with duplexes and detached properties. So it's a different bit of fabric here. And finally, another example that I really love. This is an approach to the town from the south, and these are Tinwell Villas from 1907. Feels a bit naked at the moment without the vegetation. But, you know, in a contemporary shot, I mean, just gorgeous on a summer's day. There's actually a boulevard just off screen. And that comes in at 7 dwellings per hectare. So we're dealing at very, very low densities here. And obviously that's because they're larger family houses with huge plots. But it's a typology that I think we can learn from still, as new master plan we were talking about in the previous presentation, that this typology is valid, it moves forward, it's robust, and it can be subdivided into flats within larger grounds. Here it's formal. It's got a density almost close to Arcadia, but this is a formal example of it, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, in terms of learning from Townscape and typology, all of the examples we showed were very much two-dimensional, and it was to explain to local people how density worked, really, because it's such a confusing subject. We also wanted to look at three-dimensional examples as well, and that's just a very early framework plan for the site that looks at different areas in terms of potential areas for density. We want to work that up with the community, so we don't want to rush too far ahead in terms of master planning. We don't want to do too much design at this point. We want to just do a pattern book, basically, and then design the community up with the local people, really. But in terms of those red numbers, what we've chosen are different viewpoints. 1 and 3, I think, are one is a town centre example, and one is the Tinwell Villas that we've sketched up in a little bit more detail. The other two are approaches into the new master planning area from the north, basically. So a new gateway and a potential new local centre. And we wanted to compare existing with potential, again to give local people an idea of how that works in terms of a like-for-like basis. So we use, you know, as an artist, we would sketch that up. And a space like that, Ironmonger Street, as a sketch, to everyone in this room, it feels intrinsically right. We know why it's right in terms of urban design principles. I won't read all of those labels, but it's a classic sort of textbook street. You know, Gell, Cullen, Lynch would all have a lot to say about a street like that. And I think they're absolutely right. But I think local Stamford residents also love streets like this, and they love them, but it's more of an instinctive thing, and we just want to bring that out a little bit in them. So by explaining and labeling things, so it's not meant to be simplistic, but it's just meant to use fairly basic language as opposed to sort of urban design speak. In pattern books, we also we do snapshots of elevations to just talk about rhythms and colors and materials, and even though it's all linked together by Lincolnshire limestone, there's different varieties and textures, and the signage is different, and there's such a vibrancy of colors. We wanted to pull that into the pattern book. But in terms of comparing the previous sketch on Ironmonger Street, we wanted to propose something. Now this is a local centre as opposed to a town centre, and the architecture is historic here. It's an illustration. It could be contemporary, it could be both really, but we've tried to pull some of the same principles in, that it's pedestrianised, that there's activation on the edge, that there's a rhythm to the buildings, that it leads on to landmarks and parks, that it's a high quality environment, that the plot is important in terms of the verticality of the plot. So all of those things are important. And finally, I just want to look at the last two slides here, Tinwell Road again. I return to this because I love it in terms of its calibration, particularly from public to private realm, from the streetscape to the building itself. It steps up a couple of times. There's landscape buffering. There's a calibration up into the front porch, the front stoop, bay windows. There's a rhythm to it. It has a grandness. It really feels like it is a gateway typology for Stamford. As you drive into it from the south, this really, really resonates as a gateway typology. Now, we were tasked with doing something similar to the north, but we were told that we had to use employment there, that was the right location for employment because it's right next to the A1. What we didn't want to do is a series of glass boxes or something that is unsympathetic to Stamford. So we said, well, let's use that typology to a certain extent. Not copy it or replicate it, and again, this could be contemporary as opposed to more traditional, but to bring up some of those principles where there's a calibration between street and building, where the building is set back a little bit and allowed to breathe, the same rhythms, the bays, the range of typologies, but it shows the robustness of the urban villa typology. And all of this has been encapsulated in a pattern book, and we're hoping to continue to work with the Town Council with it. So I'll now pass on to Monica, my colleague.